The overhead bin latch was cold under her fingers, the kind of cold that comes from recirculated air at 37,000 feet, even when the plane was still parked at the gate, and she noticed it the way she noticed most things now, which was precisely and without comment. Nora Vasquez was 38 years old, wearing a gray pullover that had pilled at the cuffs and jeans that had been clean at 5 that morning, which was 4 hours ago. She had one bag. It was a soft-sided black duffel, 22 inches, the kind designed to fit without argument into any standard overhead compartment, and she had been carrying some version of it for the better part of 15 years. She slid it in, heard the satisfying give of the foam, and stepped back to let the woman behind her pass into the window seat. The plane smelled of old coffee and synthetic orange from whatever the ground crew had sprayed on the seats. Nora sat down in 31C, the aisle seat, and she put her left hand in her lap and her right hand on the armrest, and she looked at nothing in particular, which was how she traveled now. The boarding announcement had asked the rear zone passengers to come forward 9 minutes before, which meant the early boarding and middle boarding passengers had already been sitting long enough to feel settled, which meant their things were in the bins. The man came down the aisle at a pace that expected compliance from the air around him. He was somewhere in his middle 50s, with the particular build of a person who had eaten well for 20 years and worn suits that were cut to conceal it. And he wore that suit now, charcoal, with a faint stripe, and he had the look of a person who had not been made to wait for a very long time. He stopped at row 26. He looked at the bin. He looked at his assistant, who was a few paces behind him, carrying 2 bags to his one, and he opened the bin above 26 and found it full, and he moved forward, without speaking to anyone, until he reached row 31, and he opened that bin, and there was Nora's black duffel, and he took hold of it. "This needs to go somewhere else," he said, and his voice was calibrated to carry. He said it to the bin rather than to Nora, which was a choice. Nora looked at the duffel in his hand. She did not move. She did not speak. The woman in the window seat found something on her phone. The man in 32A turned fractionally toward the window. A flight attendant 2 rows forward paused with a seatbelt demonstrator in his hand and looked down at his shoes. The man moved Nora's duffel to the floor of the aisle, and he lifted his own bag into the overhead bin above row 31, and he settled it, and he lowered the latch. He had not looked at Nora directly once. What happened next was small. Nora reached down and lifted her duffel from the floor with one hand, and she turned it slightly as she did, and a strip of heavy canvas webbing on the outside of the bag caught the light, and on that webbing, stitched in a pattern of repeating color, was a thing that looked like a service ribbon. It was not a decoration. It was not a luggage tag. It was something else, and it meant something specific. And 12 rows forward, a man in a dark uniform jacket glanced up from the manifest he was holding and went very still. He was not a flight attendant. He set the manifest down on the beverage cart beside him. He did not look away. Whatever he had just understood, he had understood it completely, and the morning's particular ordering of the world was about to come apart, at exactly the seam where that man was standing. Before we go any further, if you have ever been the most qualified person in the room, and the last one anyone thought to ask, drop "I was there" in the comments and hit subscribe, because this story is going to stay with you. The morning Nora Vasquez arrived at Gate 14 of Harmon Regional Airport in Talcott, West Virginia, she had been awake for 26 hours and had driven a borrowed pickup truck 112 miles on 2-lane roads that had been wet and then icy and then wet again. And she had done this because the bus she had planned to take had a mechanical issue at 3:45 in the morning, and because there was no other way to get there in time, and because being there in time was not optional. She was not dressed for the flight she was about to take. She had packed in 11 minutes in a house that was not yet fully hers, a rental in a town she had been living in for 4 months, and the gray pullover and the jeans were the warmest things within arm's reach when the phone had rung. She had one bag because she had always traveled with one bag. The duffel was black and soft-sided and 22 inches long, and on the outside of it, along a strip of canvas webbing that she had stitched on herself in a military family housing unit in Tacoma, Washington, 8 years earlier, were the accumulated service ribbons of a woman who had spent 11 years as a flight nurse in the United States Army. The ribbons were small, and the bag was unremarkable, and in most rooms and most airports, those two things canceled each other out entirely. Harmon Regional was small enough that it had one gate, one TSA lane, and a coffee cart that ran out of oat milk by 7 in the morning. It was not the kind of airport where people looked at each other's luggage. Nora had cleared security in 4 minutes, bought a black coffee, and sat in the single row of connected plastic chairs along the window, with her duffel between her feet, her hands wrapped around the cup, watching the tarmac the way she watched most things, which was without sentimentality and with a quiet precision that had nothing to do with anxiety. She was flying to Charlotte first, then connecting to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for a reason she had not explained to anyone at the rental house, because there was no one at the rental house to explain it to. She had been given a phone number 6 days earlier by a woman she knew from a logistics unit out of Joint Base Lewis McChord, and the woman had told her that a certain Colonel Marcus Irwin was receiving a ceremony that he had been refusing for 3 years, and that he had asked specifically and by name for Nora Vasquez to be in the room, and that if Nora said she was unable to come, the colonel's response had been, and the woman had hesitated before repeating it, that it had taken long enough already, and there were not unlimited mornings left to do the right thing. Nora had been out of the Army for 2 years and 7 months. She did not look like what she had been. She was 38, and she was medium height, and she had a face that rested in a state of mild attention, and she wore no insignia and kept no military identification visible, because she was a civilian now, and that was accurate, and she had chosen it. She did not discuss her service. She did not enumerate it. She did not correct people who assumed she had been, as one neighbor had put it, a desk job, or who assumed, as the man at the Talcott hardware store had put it when she mentioned Fort Bragg, that her husband had been stationed there. She had no husband. She had a duffel, and a boarding pass, and a borrowed truck she had left in the long-term lot. The flight from Harmon to Charlotte was operated by a regional carrier called Meridian Air, and the aircraft was a 76-seat turboprop that Nora recognized by its engine frequency before she saw the tail number, which was an involuntary habit she had not yet trained out of herself. There were 41 passengers booked on the morning run, and 39 of them had boarded without incident. The 40th was a man named Garrett Holloway, and he had boarded in the second tier of the priority lane because he held a premium card on a partner airline that Meridian honored through a reciprocal agreement. He was 54 years old. He wore a charcoal suit with a faint chalk stripe, and he wore it the way men wear suits, when the suit is the first thing they want you to understand about them. He was the regional director of a commercial property acquisition firm based out of Charleston, and he traveled this route approximately 3 times per month, and the flight staff knew his face and knew his preferences, and knew that his preferences were presented as requirements. He had with him 1 rolling carry-on and 1 briefcase, and he had behind him his assistant, a young man of about 27 named Paul, who carried both items and spoke only when asked, and had the practiced near invisibility of someone who had learned how to be useful without being present. Garrett Holloway sat in 26B by his own long-standing arrangement with the check-in desk, and he always used the overhead bin directly above 26B, and this morning, that bin was already full because a family in 25 had a baby and a baby means equipment. He had looked at the bin. He had moved forward without speaking to anyone about it. There is a particular kind of social violence that operates entirely in the passive voice, the bin that needs to go somewhere else, rather than the bag that he is moving, the slight built to be deniable to anyone who reviews it later. Garrett Holloway was not a cruel man in any clinical sense. He was a man who had been agreed with for so long that disagreement had ceased to feel like information. He moved Nora's duffel to the floor, and he did not look at her while he did it, because she was not, in the architecture of that moment, the kind of person whose response would matter. The woman in the window seat found something on her phone. The man in 32A turned toward the window. The flight attendant with the seatbelt demonstrator looked at his shoes. Paul, the assistant, stood in the aisle behind Garrett with both bags and his eyes fixed on a middle distance that was not any part of the scene. Nora looked at her duffel on the floor, and she reached down and picked it up, and she did not speak, and she did not raise her voice, and this was not because she could not. It was the particular stillness of someone who has learned the difference between the moments that require a response and the moments that do not, and who has spent 11 years in conditions where that calculation was not abstract. She was holding the duffel at hip height when the canvas webbing caught the light from the oval window, and the ribbons were briefly, plainly visible, and 12 rows forward, the man in the dark uniform jacket, who was not a flight attendant, looked up from the manifest on the beverage cart and did not look away. His name was Captain Douglas Reyes of the United States Army, and he was traveling in civilian clothes on an administrative leave before a transfer, and he had a particular reason to know what a flight nurse's service ribbon stack looked like on an 11-year record. He had been the commanding officer of a medevac unit at Kandahar Airfield from 2011 to 2013. He set the manifest down on the cart. His jaw moved once, and then was still. He looked at Nora's face, and he looked at the ribbons, and he looked at the back of Garrett Holloway's head, and the expression on Douglas Reyes's face was not anger, and it was not surprise. It was the specific and calibrated expression of a man who has just understood what room he is actually in. If you have ever been the person in the room who knew exactly what was happening and had no standing yet to say so, drop "I was there" in the comments right now. Because there is a reason Nora Vasquez had not spoken a single word in 3 minutes, and it had nothing to do with the duffel, and everything to do with a name she had been carrying for 2 years and 7 months that she had not said out loud to anyone except once, in a parking lot in Tacoma, in the rain, to a woman she would not see again. Nora had told the story exactly one time in its entirety, and she had told it to a social worker named Renata Ochoa, who had been assigned to Nora's out-processing unit at Joint Base Lewis McChord in the autumn of the year Nora separated from the Army. Renata was 41 years old and wore her hair in a bun secured with a green clip, and had the kind of stillness that people in that profession develop after years of holding space for things that cannot be fixed, only witnessed. Nora had sat across from her in a beige office with a window that looked out onto a parking lot where the trees had gone bare, and Renata had asked, as she was required to ask, whether there was anything about the transition that Nora needed to document for the record, and Nora had said no, and Renata had looked at her in the particular way of a person who has heard that specific no many times and knows what it is covering, and she had put down her pen, and she had said, "You don't have to, but I'm going to sit here until we're done either way." Nora had looked at the parking lot for a long time. Then she told Renata about First Lieutenant Caleb Drury. Caleb Drury had been 26 years old when Nora met him, a helicopter crew chief from Georgia, with a gap in his front teeth and a habit of taping photographs to the interior of his helmet case, because he said looking at them, when he was scared, reminded him that scared was temporary. He had been assigned to Nora's medevac unit in the spring of 2013, and he had been her crew chief on 47 missions over the 14 months that followed, and Nora had trusted him with the specific and total trust of someone who knows that trust in that context is not a feeling, but a physical fact, the way you trust a rivet, or a cable, or a rated load limit. He had been 27 years old when a hydraulic failure during a night extraction mission in Kunar province had sent their aircraft into the side of a ridgeline, and he had been 27 years old when Nora, who had been thrown clear of the wreck and had 3 broken ribs and a separated shoulder, had gone back into the burning fuselage 6 times to pull out the other members of the crew, and had not been able to reach Caleb because the impact had sealed the crew chief's compartment, and she had known, because she had been a flight nurse for 8 years at that point, and she had her hands against the door panel and she could feel the heat through the metal, that she was too late by the time she got there. The Army's official account noted that First Lieutenant Caleb Drury died of injuries sustained in a non-combat aircraft incident. The account noted that the actions of the unit's flight nurse in recovering 3 additional crew members had been conducted under conditions of significant personal risk. The account did not recommend a citation because the investigating officer had categorized the recovery actions as standard emergency protocol. Nora had signed the document and separated from the Army 14 months later and had not contested it. She had carried a small length of parachute cord on her left wrist since the night in Kunar, knotted 3 times, one for each crew member she had reached, and she had worn it under her sleeve every day since, and she wore it now, on the turboprop to Charlotte, and no one had ever asked her what it meant. Douglas Reyes had asked Colonel Marcus Irwin once, years later, how a person carried a thing like that, and Marcus had said that some people put it down and some people wear it, and the ones who wear it are not weaker than the ones who put it down. They are just more honest about what it weighs. Douglas did not know, sitting 12 rows forward in the cabin of a turboprop in West Virginia, that Nora Vasquez had been the flight nurse in Kunar. He knew her ribbons, and he knew her posture, and he knew the way she had picked up that duffel from the floor with one hand, without any expression changing on her face, and what he knew from those 3 things was enough to tell him that whatever Garrett Holloway thought had happened in row 31 had not happened the way he thought. Douglas Reyes stood up from his seat. He moved down the aisle in the unhurried way of someone who does not need the aisle to cooperate with him because he has moved down worse aisles in worse conditions, and it no longer registers as a thing requiring adjustment. He stopped at row 31. He looked at Nora. He did not look at Garrett. He said, "Where are you headed?" And his voice was conversational and flat and exactly loud enough for the row behind them to hear. Nora looked at him for a moment. "Fort Bragg," she said. "Colonel Irwin's ceremony." Douglas Reyes went still for 1 full second, in the way that a person goes still when a thing they already partly knew is confirmed entirely. He said, "You served with him." It was not a question. "I served under him," Nora said. And Douglas Reyes sat down in the empty seat in 31B, which was the middle seat, the least comfortable seat on any aircraft, and he did it without comment, and the manifest stayed on the beverage cart 12 rows forward, and Garrett Holloway, who had been watching this from 26B, with the particular attention of a man who can feel the geometry of a room shifting without yet understanding why, turned forward in his seat and looked at the headrest in front of him. The emergency was not dramatic in the way emergencies in films are dramatic. It announced itself as a sound, a sustained low tone from the forward galley at approximately 42 minutes into the flight, and it announced itself simultaneously as a shift in the flight attendant's movement pattern, which went from the measured drift of a routine service to the particular compressed efficiency of a practiced response. And Nora registered both signals before the PA system said anything, because she had been registering those 2 signals in combination for 11 years, and her body had not forgotten the arithmetic. The flight attendant, a woman of about 30, whose name tag read Torres, came down the aisle at a controlled pace that was slower than a run and faster than a walk, and she stopped at row 19, where a man was holding his own throat with both hands and had the specific color of someone whose airway was not moving air. He was perhaps 60 years old, heavy through the chest, and he had been eating a small packet of crackers, and the cracker was not entirely the problem, because the problem was also that his face had gone from pink to a color that meant the clock was already running. Torres said, "Is anyone on board a medical professional?" And her voice was steady and loud, and she said it to the whole cabin. Douglas Reyes was already standing. He was not a medical professional. He knew it, and he sat back down. The woman in 28A said she was a nurse, but she was already explaining she was a pediatric nurse, and her hands were not moving toward the aisle. 3 other people looked at each other. Nora had already stood up. She was in the aisle before Torres finished the sentence. She said, "Flight nurse, 11 years, I've got him," and her voice was not a request. She moved to row 19 in 4 steps, and she put one hand on the man's sternum, and she looked at his throat, and she looked at his color, and she made 3 calculations in the time it takes most people to make one. And she said to Torres, without looking at her, "Do you have an emergency kit with a manual suction device or an NPA kit aboard?" And Torres said yes. and Nora said, "Get it now, and bring me 2 pairs of gloves." The man's name was Warren Alcott, and he was 58 years old, and he had been traveling alone, and he was very afraid, and Nora could see that, and she said to him in a voice that was about 18 inches from his ear, and completely level, "I know what I'm doing. You're going to be fine. I need you to try to cough on my count." She was already repositioning him, shoulders forward, torso inclined, the adjustment that creates the geometry a partially obstructed airway needs, and she did it with the specific and practiced economy of someone for whom the sequence is not a procedure to remember, but a thing the body does when the brain presents the situation. Torres came back with the kit in 45 seconds, which was fast, and Nora opened it without looking at the clasps because she had opened that specific model of emergency kit at least 200 times, and the clasps were always in the same place. She had gloves on in 8 seconds. She went through the assessment in the order she had been trained to go through it, and had reinforced through repetition until the order was structural rather than recalled. The cabin had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of people pretending nothing was happening, the quiet of people watching something they did not know how to help with and having the sense to stay out of the way. Garrett Holloway was turned fully around in his seat in 26B, his arm over the headrest, watching. His face had no expression that could be named quickly. Paul, the assistant, was standing in the aisle 2 rows back, holding the overhead handle, and his face had an expression that could be named, which was the expression of a person who has just recalibrated something. Warren Alcott coughed on Nora's 3rd count, and the partial obstruction cleared, and his color began to move in the right direction, which it did slowly and then steadily, and Nora kept her hand on his sternum and kept her eyes on his face and counted his respiratory rate silently in the way that a flight nurse counts things, which is without announcing that she is doing it. She talked him through the next 4 minutes in short, plain sentences. When his breathing had been regular for 90 seconds, she asked Torres to note his oxygen saturation on the aircraft's emergency log, and she gave Torres the specific number at which she wanted to be notified if it changed. She asked Warren Alcott if he had any cardiac history, and he said he did, and she asked if he had his medication on him, and he said he did. It was in the overhead bin, and she described which medication she meant without knowing his prescription, and named the correct one on the first attempt, and he said yes, that was right, and she said, "When Torres brings it to you, take it as prescribed, and tell me if anything changes. I'll be 4 rows back." She stood up. She handed the used gloves to Torres. She walked back to row 31, and she sat down, and she put her right hand on the armrest, and her left hand in her lap, and she looked at nothing in particular, which was how she traveled. The aircraft landed at Charlotte Douglas at 11:14 in the morning, 7 minutes ahead of schedule. The boarding bridge extended, and the door opened, and most of the 41 passengers collected their things and moved in the ordinary compression of a deplaning queue. Garrett Holloway stood up when the seatbelt sign went off, which was before most of the cabin was ready to stand, and he retrieved his rolling carry-on from the overhead bin, and he turned in the aisle toward the rear, and he stopped when he reached row 31. Nora was collecting her duffel from the bin above her, the same bin she had placed it in before he moved it, where Douglas Reyes had returned it without comment during the 3rd minute of the Alcott situation, while Nora was occupied 4 rows forward. Garrett Holloway looked at her for a moment. His jaw was set. He said, "I owe you an apology for earlier." He said it in a voice that was not loud, which was the first time he had used a voice that was not loud since boarding. He said, "I didn't know who you were." Nora looked at him. She held the duffel at her side. She said, "You didn't need to." She moved past him into the aisle, and she did not stop. The silence that followed that sentence lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was long enough for Paul the assistant, and the woman who had been in the window seat, and a man from 28, who had been listening since the Alcott situation, to hear it and to understand what it was. Douglas Reyes, who was standing in the aisle waiting to deplane, had heard it. He looked at Nora's back as she moved toward the door, and he did not say anything, which was its own form of recognition. The flight attendant Torres, who was standing at the door, with the look of someone who had processed a great many things in the past hour, said, "Thank you," to Nora as she passed. And Nora said, "He'll need someone to walk with him to the gate. He's steadier, but he shouldn't be alone." She said it about Warren Alcott, who was still in his seat waiting for ground medical staff. She was looking at Torres when she said it, and she had already moved through the door before Torres finished nodding. The report filed by Meridian Air's operations desk in Charlotte noted that a passenger medical incident on Flight 2284 from Harmon Regional had been managed prior to and without requiring diversion, and that the managing party was a former Army flight nurse traveling as a civilian passenger. The report named her correctly and gave her rank as it had been at separation, which was Warrant Officer 2, and it was the first time that rank had appeared on any document attached to Nora Vasquez's name in 2 years and 7 months. The Meridian operations manager, a tired woman of 49 named Cheryl Mott, who had been running that desk for 11 years and had seen most of what could happen on a regional aircraft, sent the report to the carrier's safety division and attached a note recommending that Warren Alcott's family be contacted and that the relevant certification board be notified of the incident in case any formal commendation was appropriate. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Nora's rental house in Talcott. It was from the Meridian Air Safety Division, and it was on company letterhead, and it was 2 paragraphs long, and it said that the actions taken by Warrant Officer 2, retired, Nora Vasquez, had been reviewed by the safety board and found to represent an exceptional standard of care under non-standard conditions, and that the carrier wished to formally recognize this in whatever form she found suitable. Nora read the letter at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee, and she folded it in thirds and put it in the drawer where she kept the things she had not yet decided what to do with. She called the number at the bottom of the letter that same afternoon, and she told the safety division coordinator that she appreciated the letter and that if the carrier was looking for a way to mark the occasion, she had one request, and she described it, and the coordinator said she would see what could be done. The request was that the aircraft, tail number registered to the turboprop she had flown on, carry in its maintenance record a notation for crew training purposes attached to the incident report that referenced the medical response in the name of First Lieutenant Caleb Drury, to whom she had been indebted for 14 months of safe passage over some very difficult country. The coordinator said she would see what could be done, and 6 weeks after that, a second letter arrived, and it confirmed that the notation had been added to the record in the form Nora had requested. Nora read it once, folded it, and put it in the same drawer. Colonel Marcus Irwin's ceremony had gone well. She had been in the room, which was what he had asked for. He had looked at her from the stage, and he had not smiled, because smiling was not how he registered things that mattered, and she had understood that completely. 4 months later, a young woman arrived at the Talcott Veterans Outreach Desk, where Nora had begun volunteering 2 mornings a week. The young woman was 22 years old and had been out of the Army for 5 months and was deciding whether to apply for a nursing program, and she had heard from someone that the woman who ran Tuesday mornings had been a flight nurse, and she asked Nora whether it was true that you could be a flight nurse and not have a traditional nursing degree going in. Nora said that you could, and described the pathway, and the young woman asked what it was like, and Nora thought about that for a moment. "It's the kind of work," she said, "where what you know is only useful while you're using it." The young woman wrote that down. Nora made no correction. If this story reminded you of someone who carried their history quietly and never asked anyone to notice it, you know who this channel is made for. Subscribe and stay close, because we have more stories about these people, told the way they deserve to be told. They were here. So were we. The young woman left at 11 o'clock, and Nora sat alone at the folding table for a few minutes, with a second cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she looked at the wall where someone had tacked a laminated list of local resources. Phone numbers for housing and food assistance, and a counseling line that Nora knew from experience was better than average, and she thought about Caleb Drury, the way she sometimes allowed herself to think about him in quiet rooms, which was directly and without flinching, the way you look at a thing you have decided not to look away from. She thought about the gap in his front teeth, and the photographs taped inside the helmet case, and the specific quality of his voice, when he called out rotor speed on a night approach, which had been low and even and had contained no excitement, because excitement in that context was a liability, and he had understood that from his first week. He had been good at the work. He had been the particular kind of good that is invisible when it is functioning and catastrophic only in its absence, and she had not said that to anyone in 2 years and 7 months, and she said it now to the empty room in Talcott, quietly and without ceremony, and the room received it the way empty rooms receive things, which is completely and without record. She finished the cold coffee. She rinsed the cup at the small sink in the corner, and she dried it with the blue towel, and she put it back on the shelf. She put on her jacket. She turned off the overhead light, and she locked the door with the key the outreach coordinator had given her, a plain brass key on a ring with no fob, and she walked out into the November air, which was cold and tasted of wood smoke from somewhere uphill, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with her hands in her pockets. The parachute cord was on her left wrist under the jacket sleeve, 3 knots, worn smooth over 2 years and 7 months of daily contact, until the knots had flattened and settled into the weave, and were no longer stiff or prominent, but simply part of the texture of the cord itself. She had not retied them. She was not going to retie them. They were what they were, and they had always been enough. She walked the 4 blocks to the borrowed truck, which was not borrowed anymore, because she had bought it from the neighbor in October for $3,200, and she unlocked it, and sat in the driver's seat, and did not start the engine immediately. She looked through the windshield at the main street of Talcott, which was 2 coffee shops and a hardware store and a post office and a diner that had a hand-lettered sign about the soup of the day, and she had driven past this block approximately 60 times in the 4 months she had been here, and she had not decided yet whether she was staying, but the decision was beginning to feel less abstract than it had in October, which was something. The notation in the aircraft maintenance record had been added with the date and the incident number and the name she had requested, and she knew this because the second letter had confirmed it, and she had not gone looking for the record itself because she did not need to see it. It was there. That was the thing about something being there, which was that it did not require your attention in order to continue being there. Caleb Drury was in the maintenance record of a 76-seat turboprop that flew the Harmon to Charlotte route 3 times daily, and every crew chief who opened that record for training purposes would read his name in the context of what good crew work made possible, which was not what Nora had asked for but was, she thought, what she had meant. She started the truck. The engine turned over on the second try, which was consistent with the truck's temperament, and she let it warm for a minute, because the November cold was the kind that stiffened the gear shift, and she watched the main street, and she thought, without quite deciding to think it, that this was a Tuesday, and she had been here on a Tuesday 3 months ago, when the outreach desk had had no one on it, and she had walked in to ask about a resource for a veteran she had met at the hardware store, a man of about 70, who had been looking at weather stripping with the particular expression of a person who had not done a home repair alone before, and she had ended up talking to him for 20 minutes in the aisle, and she had found the right weather stripping, and he had told her his name was Gerald, and that he had been a combat engineer, and that his wife had died in March, and she had listened, which was what she had available to give, and it had been enough for that Tuesday. She had been back every Tuesday since. The gear shift loosened. She put the truck in drive. The street went by, and then the edge of town went by, and then the 2-lane road opened up with the bare trees on either side, and the sky the particular flat white of a November afternoon in West Virginia, and she drove without the radio, which was how she drove now, and the parachute cord sat against her wrist under the sleeve, 3 knots, smooth and permanent and present, and the truck moved through the cold air at 51 miles per hour toward the house that was becoming hers, and there was nothing about any of it that needed to be announced.